Today's forum, Sequestration Ramifications, is about the budget sequesters and effect on social services and the military. Information about each of our speakers is in your forum flyer, so I will just do a brief introduction. Today's forum will be hosted by Check Gehring, President and CEO of LifeCare Alliance. Joining Chuck on our channel are Yvonne Hunnicutt, the Executive Director of the Human Service Chamber of Franklin County, and retired Air Force Colonel Frank Titus, and Peter Mansoor, retired Army Colonel, current General Raymond E. Mason Jr. Chair in Military History at The Ohio State University, and the author of a new critically acclaimed book, Surge, My Journey with General David Petraeus and the Remaking of the Iraq War. Please welcome everyone, and Chuck, take over the mic.
Thanks and hello and welcome, and I'm glad you're all here today for this up and peppy positive topic we're going to talk about. But actually there is some positive to this, and we'll hopefully share some of that with you. First thing I want to do, though, is since this is the week when Veterans Day occurred, we need to take a moment to thank Pete and Frank for 51 plus years of military service. Now, I'm going to run through some topics on sequestration because there's a lot of misconceptions about it. Not everybody understands what it is. But it's basically sequestration is the across-the-board governmental spending cuts that began back in March 1st of this year in 2013. It is not to be confused with the recent government shutdown. That's another loss of money for some groups. And one thing I think it's important that sequester, did you ever hear about sequester before this came up? No. It now seems to be a noun, a verb, and an adjective. So it has thoroughly entered our comments in our world, our vocabulary, and it's just amazing to me how it's worked, because originally it was sequester, now it's sequestration and blah, blah, blah. It's to sequester, and I'm sure we're sequestering and all that kind of stuff. So the Office of Management of Budget calculates it requires an annual reduction of about 5% for non-exempt, non-defense discretionary programs. Now this is on some of those slides I gave you, but I'll explain some of this. And it's a little higher, 5.1, for the non-defense mandatory programs. So let me tell you about this. And the law requires programs to be cut equally. And please note that it says in there that it's an annual reduction. This money is going to be reduced, and it's going to continue on ad infinitum unless Congress decides to put the money back, which we don't think is really going to happen. Now, the Congress did provide some flexibility, and that's why not all programs were reduced the same amount. In fact, some cuts varied by state and by sub-program. So to give you an example, LifeCare Alliance, where I live, you know us by Meals on Wheels and our visiting nurses and our Columbus Cancer Clinic and Project Open Hand, helping the seniors and medically challenged through nutrition and health care. I'm going to focus on just meals for a minute here. Meals on Wheels are under something called Title III-C2, which is part of the Older Americans Act, which was started by President Johnson in the late 60s to take care of in-home care for seniors. In Ohio, the cut for home-delivered meals was 5.38%. But the state ranges from, depending on what state you're in, from 2.96% to 5.88%. So there's a pretty good gap there as far as funding cuts by state. So the state was able to make some changes. Now there's another group within that same Title III, supportive services, whereas Ohio cut supportive service work by 0.59%, and states range from 0 to 15.46%. And that's because they don't value in some areas, and I'm not making an editorial comment here, but it's how they value the different services, and they want to keep the meals going, but not necessarily all the supportive services. So just to give you an idea, whereas preventative health services, another thing funded a little bit by the Older Americans Act, was cut 5.37% everywhere. All states did the same thing. So for us at LifeCare Alliance, to give you an idea of the impact, and we're going to use us as an example, and then Yvonne's going to help me with some other social service agencies, our reduction was approximately $175,000, which will affect us next year because we get paid off last year's money. Have I made your head spin yet? Okay. Many programs, though, and people will be affected locally, and that's very unfortunate. And the question that always comes up is, did Sequester disproportionately hurt the poor? And one thing I can say, without giving you political comment, the answer is yes. It has disproportionately hurt the poor, and it's difficult, and it's also hurt the military quite a bit. And if you're not familiar, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, those three items consume 64% of all federal spending, and they were exempt. They were not affected by this, as you've been reading, and I'm not making a political comment on that one because those are very key programs that many of our clients take advantage of. But they're 64% of the federal budget. So again, a lot of people felt when they heard sequestered, everything got cut. Everything didn't get cut. In fact, the minority of federal spending is what got cut. These were not also the first cuts. People think this is the first time sequesters hit any of the groups mentioned. That's not the case. We've been cut by for different reasons over the past decade, and especially when the economy took a downward turn a few years ago, we got cut a little more. So the question is, what's going to happen going forward? Well, we are probably, I want to tell you, I can't mention another city, but of the top 50 cities nationally, just on the Meals on Wheels side, we are probably the only ones right now without a waiting list. And the question comes, what's that going to do? What are you going to see coming up, given that everybody has a waiting list right now? Well, Meals on Wheels of America tells us that 70% of our programs around the country are cutting the number of meals served. 50% are reducing the number of clients served. Well, there's a difference there because some people get 2 meals a day versus 1, so they can cut the number of meals. But 50% of the programs around the country are reducing the number of clients served. 70% are establishing or adding to waiting lists, and 40% are reducing the number of days they deliver a meal, i.e. they're not going out on holidays, weekends, things like that. I know a lot of the programs in Ohio currently do not deliver on weekends. We still deliver 365. I'll tell you why in a minute. But clients are affected and jobs are affected, obviously, because most of our budget is payroll for people to provide a service. What's in the future? Well, I would tell you from our end, and we're going to hear from the military folks here in a minute, but from the not-for-profit end, we need to develop new and innovative ways to attract volunteers and donors because we need more of them. Especially in our world, we live off volunteers, and donor support is just so important. We need new ways to attract them, and instead of doing everything the same old way. And I would tell you, for example, in our world, there's shell shock going on out there right now because many people that do Meals on Wheels around the country, as an example, have never fundraised. So they're starting something new. Secondly is increase something called social entrepreneurship, which is a for-profit piece of your not-for-profit. Another way to raise revenues to get more money in. So for example, we have a catering company that goes out, and the profits from the catering company this year will pay for about 300 to 400 of our clients that we couldn't serve any other way. And I'm not sure what the military is going to do if they're going to have social entrepreneurship. We'll hear from them in a minute. But I know I could use a bodyguard some days. So anyway, I'm trying to be funny here on a tough topic. And also increase mergers and collaborations. You're going to see what you already have seen. We've taken on 4 merger partners of other agencies. It's been wonderful marriages, but it helps cut back on the overhead costs and allows you to see more clients and take care of more people, and just collaborations as a whole, helping each other out a little bit. And how many of you are on a board of a not-for-profit right now? Yeah, and the ones that aren't are probably volunteers doing a lot, especially with this group. The question we have to ask ourselves is, who's on our board? Do we have people on our boards now that can make decisions to make sure that we are good going forward? In the old days, I still know of Meals on Wheels organizations in very small communities where all the board members are clients. And we love our clients to death, but they may not be wired to make the difficult decisions that are needed as we go forward. So we're looking for board members with certain skill sets, and then it gets into the whole issue with these cuts. What is your responsibility as a board member? And I can tell you it's changed a lot the past 10 years. You're responsible, if you are on a board, for a lot more than you used to be. You know, how are we progressing? What is the trend? It's more than looking at the P&L on a monthly basis. So that's kind of an overview of Sequester. And now we're going to go to our panelists and hear from them. And as long as we're on the not-for-profit topic, we're going to start here with Yvonne, who's my buddy, who represents the Human Service Chamber, which is a group of 70 not-for-profits here locally, very innovative model nationally, who have gotten together in order to support each other and learn from each other. So Yvonne, as Executive Director of the Chamber, what effects have you heard of from our members, and how widespread is that impact?
So thank you, Chuck, and good afternoon, everyone. First, I'd like to just talk about the fact that in our unique world in the nonprofit sector, not only are we impacted socially, but we're impacted economically, and there's an integration of services that happens too when we are seeing cuts in the state, the local, defense, and tourism, and arts and culture. Budget experts right here in Ohio estimated that by the end of the federal fiscal year in September, that Ohio will stand to lose $184 million. That would include all of the services that Chuck mentioned, our military and defense, and other services moving forward. So let me just give you a snapshot of some of the immediate results and some of the immediate hits that we're seeing right now. A little less than 1,500 children have been cut from Head Start programs right here in our state. A little less than 1,500. That number will increase by 2014. A little more than 70% of our programs are establishing and maintaining longer waiting lists, as Chuck mentioned before, including those programs that are covering seniors by an average of 58. So that's an additional 58 people who are on these waiting lists, even if they have not established waiting lists in the past. We're seeing a deeper cuts to safety net services, so this includes your health care, workforce development, mental health, housing, all of these items who help families become much more self-sufficient so that they can adequately contribute to the society. A growing suburbanization of poverty. So now we're beginning to see families who were traditionally not eligible for programs become more eligible, and many of them are unaware or don't know how to access some of these resources. So in many of our suburban areas, we're opening pantries. We're seeing a longer number of families trying to access those pantries. Young people, children are qualifying for free and reduced lunches. And we're opening more innovative programs in the summertime, so some of those young people can receive nutritional meals where in the past those programs have been cut. Of course, the employee furloughs, which our guest from the military will talk about that in a moment. Some of our nutritional programs around women, infant, and children, which also is known as WIC, and commodity food programs administered by some of our local food banks. And then lastly, since about 2009, Ohio has seen a decline in our Workforce Investment Act, which is also known as WIA. We are now at the lowest record allocation for the history of the WIA program at $80 million. So we went from $174 million to $80 million right here in Ohio to be able to provide for our workforce development type of programs. And then just as Chuck mentioned before, trying to lighten the mood just a little bit, even in my hometown, Cleveland hosts annually the air show during Labor Day weekend. And this summer, the air show was eliminated. Typically, we draw approximately 60 to 100,000 people, and it generates somewhere between $7.1 million just as an economic growth in my community. This year, we didn't have the air show. And for some folks, this is a family weekend, this is a family tradition. This is sometimes the only opportunities that some young people get to see those kind of aircrafts and jets in our community. So this hits us hard, and it's hitting us immediately. The last item I'd like to bring to your attention in terms of doing furthering the research that we've been doing right here in Ohio, our public universities, we're estimating at this point to a loss of about $95 million in research for many of our public universities. I don't need to necessarily share with you how important this is for us to be able to do some of the work we do. We rely very heavily on the Ohio State University and some of our other institutions of higher learning. But with that kind of loss, how can we continue to suggest the data and how the data supports the work that we've been doing in the community? So this is what we're seeing immediately, Chuck, in the community, and this is what many of our agencies are thinking through. How can we continue to provide services on very limited budgets?
Thank you very much, Yvonne. Now let's go to our friends at the military, who we know we need very strongly. And I'm going to start with Frank over here. Frank, I described sequestration, how it affects social programs. Could you kind of give us an overview of how the military is being affected by sequestration?
Yes, in the divvying up the work today, Peter has been kind enough to do the strategic view of that, and he's well qualified to do that. I'll talk about the Ohio impact of it, if I might. And I would open just with a brief comment, paraphrasing Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel in a speech within the past week, saying that we're going to be needing to look to diplomacy and development increasingly, not just the use of military power to solve our international needs. He echoes the sentiments of the Secretaries of Defense that preceded him, Bill Cohen in the 90s, and also his immediate predecessor under two presidents, Mr. Gates, who served in both Democratic and Republican administrations. For reasons that we'll be talking about in just a moment, there simply will not be the same military capabilities available starting immediately that there have been available for the past decade since the global war on terrorism began. So it's out of sheer necessity, if nothing else. I would suggest to you there are other doctrinal reasons that may be appropriate as well. Let me talk about the Ohio National Guard. I spent 30 years in the Ohio Air National Guard and was recalled to active duty for 2 years during the Vietnam War with the Ohio Air Guard. I spent 2 years right at the end of my high school tenure with the West Virginia Army National Guard. So I went through Army basic training and radio operator school as a 17-year-old and 18-year-old. I've had a little experience with both. Late in my Air Force career, I was primarily working with U.S. Army units, so that green color seemed rather familiar to me. Ohio has 16,000 members in the combined Air Guard and Army Guard programs. 11,000 members are in the Army Guard and just about 5,000 members in the Air National Guard. When Adjutant General Deborah Ashenhurst testified in front of the Ohio legislature on April 25th this year in asking for the state matching money, which is at a fairly low percentage, to get the federal dollars to flow in, because most of the National Guard programs are funded with federal dollars and federal equipment, not state dollars. She projected that the federal buy-in here in Ohio for fiscal year 2014-15, that biennium, would be $625 million federal dollars. And for every dollar that Ohio chooses not to put into the matching fund workup, we lose $3 federal dollars. This is true in many social service areas as well. The infrastructure, we can talk about indirect benefits, and you've heard some talk about that. It's not just that the $300 million out of that $625 million would go to the salaries for either full-time and part-time members of the Army National Guard and Air National Guard, but you have to understand the infrastructure issues. Air National Guard units are usually located on international airports, regional airports, or municipal airports, and they have been historically, since 1947, when the Air National Guard program was founded in Ohio, cash cows that help regional airports stay open during lean times. I was a JAG at Rickenbacker as a weekender, a part-timer, during the conversion from an Air Force base to an air industrial park and international airport. And I will not say in a shy way that had the Air National Guard not had a significant presence at Rickenbacker, that process, which has ultimately been successful, and it fits into the whole intermodal transportation hub that we have here in Central Ohio, I'm not sure that would have gotten done. That conversion process and attracting major air freight carriers in particular didn't go quite as quickly as we had hoped it would. But the Air National Guard was there to provide that cash flow. The same is true at Mansfield-Lom Airport in Mansfield, Ohio, at Toledo Express Airport in Swanton, Ohio, just outside Toledo. And now Toledo Express Airport, interestingly enough, is the largest freight carrying airport in all of Ohio. It carries the freight for Detroit. Detroit International Airport handles the domestic passenger and international passenger traffic. So there's a lot of flow-through benefits to having a National Guard. General Ashenhurst is a force provider. She provides trained and equipped forces to both the Army and the Air Force upon request from the President, and she provides trained and equipped military forces to the Governor of Ohio for disaster relief or emergency law enforcement purposes. So she is in what they refer to in law school as a dual sovereign situation, and it is what my law school professor used to refer to as a fibers of federalism program, because it is truly a federal-state partnership and must be understood as that. And the governors play a critical role in negotiations with the Department of the Army and the Department of the Air Force and how all that works. I'll tell you what I think General Ashenhurst's priorities will be as we move further into sequestration. That will be to try to save the positions of as many as you can of the 16,000 troops in the Army Guard and Air Guard, to try to save the major military weapon systems. I'm referring to large fixed-wing aircraft like KC-135 air refuelers, C-130 transport aircraft, as well as fighter jets. And on the Army side, a fleet of utility helicopters, Black Hawks, and the new Lakota helicopter, which are very valuable, especially in state emergencies for search, air, rescue, and recovery sorts of activities. These will be some of the things we'll look at. We want to try to save the people. We want to try to save the major systems. And in terms of the infrastructure, and I don't for a moment mean to indicate that Army facilities, Army National Guard facilities, aren't important in the communities where they're located. We used to have an Army National Guard armory in every county in Ohio as part of our state defense preparedness situation, our emergency defense situation. That's not happened. We've needed to consolidate them for economic reasons. But the Army Guard provides very, very important infrastructure support and flow-through benefits in the communities it's in. On the Air Force side, it's a little more easily demonstrable because of the size of the units and how critical in the budget of these various civilian airports they are. I think those would basically be my comments.
Frank, that's fabulous, and we appreciate that. So, Pete, we're up to you, and you comment on these topics on CNN and Fox and everywhere else. So tell us the strategy side of this.
Well, thank you for inviting me to appear today. I echo your comments on sequestration and its dictionary definition. I think the word could only be improved if it were only 4 letters long. Take your pick. So there's a couple things I want to talk about. One is the budgetary impact of the sequestration at the national level. After every war, there's a drawdown, and there's a reduction in the military budget. Bill Clinton famously had a defense holiday in the 1990s, and you know, it's good. The money is either returned to the taxpayers of the United States or it's diverted to other purposes. Sorry. So after the wars of 9/11 began to draw down, the Department of Defense was ordered to find savings of $500 billion over a 10-year period. And this was under Secretary Bob Gates, and he did that, and the military thought they could live with it. Well, what the sequestration has done is it's added another $500 billion cut over 10 years on top of that. So now it's $1 trillion over 10 years. And what they thought was a cut they could live with has become a cut that they don't think they can live with. And why is that? Because we still have more money going into our defense budget than, you know, take your pick, the next 10 countries combined or whatnot. Well, pay, benefit, and pensions are protected. There's actually been some trial balloons put forward by the Secretary of Defense on trimming back some military pay and benefits. It's received, it's not been well received either in the military community or on Capitol Hill, and it's unlikely to happen. What's more likely to happen is trimming back of health care, especially retiree health care, and the retirees will be expected to pay more for that That's already happened here in Columbus at any rate, and I can attest to that. Weapons programs, well, you can cancel weapons programs, but that takes political will because the weapons are produced somewhere and they create jobs in the various districts. The military is very good at spreading these weapons programs out so that most states are affected by when you cancel major weapon systems. You could spread them out and buy them over a longer period of time, but that increases the per unit costs. So that's why you get airplanes instead of costing, so let's just take a random figure of $20 million per plane. Now they're $60 million per plane. At the same time, even if you were to restructure those contracts, it's going to take years to come into effect. And so you won't see the immediate savings. So what then gets cut? Operations, training, and maintenance, because they have no political stakeholders. So you cut back on the use of gasoline and oil, you cut back on steaming days, flight hours, and you cut back on trips to the National Training Center. What does this do to the military? It reduces readiness. Now, that may be okay if we don't face a major war in the next 10 years or 20 years or however long this lasts, but if you do, then stand by for the finger pointing among the politicians as to who's responsible for sending unready U.S. troops into combat and potentially having them be defeated. So that's what's getting cut right now. Of the 35 or so Army brigades, only 2 are deemed combat ready. Those are the ones in the United States. We still send fully trained and ready brigades to the war in Afghanistan. That has priority. But what's left is mostly unready. Contracting has been cut so that services that over the last 30 years has migrated to civilian workforce like dining facilities and grounds maintenance and whatnot. Well, that's going back to the military now. They're firing or not renewing the contracts of the civilians. So you have soldiers now on KP, soldiers mowing lawns, mowing grass, doing the things that soldiers did in the 1970s when we had a hollow army. And that's the direction we're headed again. So that's sort of the budgetary impact and what sequestration does to the armed forces. The situation reminds me of a comment by Ernest Rutherford, who's a New Zealand physicist. It was in the 1930s, sometimes attributed to Winston Churchill. And he said words to the effect of, "Gentlemen, we've run out of money. It's now time to think." And that's the other way to handle sequestration. Rather than just doing salami slice cutting and keeping 35 brigades, 12 carrier battle groups, X number of fighter wings, and having them be less ready, is to reassess the U.S. grand strategy and figure out, okay, if we don't have as much military capability, what strategic tasks are we willing to give up and either do without or assume. If you don't do without and you have less ready and fewer forces, then you're assuming more risk as a nation. Are we willing to do that? Or do we just give up tasks, or do we now do them in a collective fashion and find alliances that we can work within to handle these sorts of things? And this is sort of the big, broad-reaching, grand strategic reassessment that has not been done by this administration. It's an administration that just doesn't think in those terms, and I'd be surprised if it happens, but I'd be pleasantly surprised if it happens. I'm hoping it does. The quadrennial defense review is coming up, so that's one vehicle where the military and the government could do this reassessment. Unfortunately, the QDR in the past has been nothing more than sort of staking out budget positions, and this is what's happening in Washington today. And I hear what my colleague says about, well, it's time to use more diplomacy and so forth, but it reminds me of the quote by Henry Kissinger that diplomacy without the threat of force is like a symphony without instruments. We all hope for the best, but hope is not a course of action.
Good. Well, Frank, what do you, let's go back to Frank for a minute on this subject. I think it's a beautiful summary. What do you see, what in your opinion is going to happen in Ohio once all this takes place and as we go forward? What's your opinion of what's going to happen? Are we going to close things or what?
Well, there's a story running this morning from the wire services that an Ohio legislator, a member of Congress from the Dayton area, is saying that 6,000 military and civilian positions will be lost at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base alone. So the sequester has been seen as carving with a meat cleaver, not a scalpel, and the effects are draconian. I've had a chance to ride through this wave. I'm not sure I'd call it a sine wave, but it's a wave since 1963. So I was in the build-up towards Vietnam. My unit received all sorts of additional training days, training opportunities, including training with the regular Army in Hawaii, the 25th Infantry Division, in some combined arms exercises, dropping live ordnance in support of their fire and movement units before they deployed to the Republic of Vietnam. Then on the backside, we were recalled for 2 years. On the backside of that, I saw all that money stripped out. Peter's referred to the hollow forces during the 70s. I can't say too much about that because I was out of the service for 8.5 years after Vietnam, and then came back after law school. But clearly our forces were not in a position in terms of their training, equipment, or experience to have engaged in major international conflicts, and some of the rather minor ones we engaged in, we had mixed results in terms of what we were able to do. So that training issue, and the training is typically the first thing that goes when General Ashenhurst has to take her scalpel and start with this, it will be the training days that are likely to go first. And as Peter has indicated to you, once you lose part of that training, you lose capacity, you lose operational capability. One of the phrases that was used back before World War II was you have a concept of the value in a strategic sense of battleships in port or battleships at sea. That's when battleships, not carriers, ruled the world, right? And the thinking was maybe there really is a strategic deterrence value to having a battleship moored in port, even though maybe it couldn't even steam out. I think we've moved past that idea, but it was talked about as recently as the Falklands War in 1983. You've got to understand, and I think you do, that yes, the numbers have to work. You know, we've got to make these budget things work out to comply with law. However, you're not going to have the forces available at either the national and international level or at the state level that would be needed to meet certain exigent, critical circumstances relating to all of our security.
Pete, on the national level, you talked about reassessments, and it's time, in your words, to think. So if you go in the time machine 10 years from now, what do you think is going to happen globally for us?
Well, the problem with predicting the future is it hasn't happened yet. Yogi Berra. So the question is what is Congress?
Be wrong.
That's right. But I'll be on record. So there's some things that Congress could do. They could authorize another round of base closures, and that certainly would affect Ohio as well as other communities. That would be a money saver, and with a lower amount of military forces, certainly that's something that should be considered, but probably won't be, because again, that goes to the jobs and what gets congressmen elected. The Army is likely to draw down, well, it is drawing down right now to 480,000 troops, and that's where it was before the buildup to fight the wars of 9/11. But it's likely to go down even further. I think a mark on the wall might be 420, somewhere between 400,000 and 420,000. There have been some, not ironically, Navy officers who have said, oh, really, we should go down to about 320,000 for the Army and rely more on the reserves. So the Army and the Navy now are at each other's throat again, and not just on the football field. So we'll see how far the Army goes down, but it certainly will draw down below 480,000. The Navy, well, it's going to lose some of those carrier battle groups. It might go down. It's at was at 12. So let's say it goes down to 9. How many can you keep at sea at any given time? A third are in refit. A third are working up or coming back from deployments, and that leaves maybe two or three that you can have on deployment at any given time. Well, where in the world do you put them? You want one in the Pacific. You probably want one in the Arabian Gulf area, and that leaves one other that you might have in the Med. And when you're the President of the United States thinking, where do I need aircraft to be available? Potential conflict with Iran, potential action in Syria or Libya, those sorts of places. And of course, you have a rising China. So the capability gap gets pretty wide. In terms of weapons programs in the next 10 years, the question is what's going to be cut? You can cut a lot of little things, and the Army's canceled its next generation of armored vehicles, for instance. But what about the big ones? I mean, the ones that really suck up the defense dollars, the most expensive airplane purchase program in the history of the nation, the F-35 fighter. We're going to do anything with that? Well, there's a lot of allies that are buying that plane as well. Air tankers. You mentioned KC-135 tankers. They're older than me. And so we certainly need to replace them, but that's an expensive program. For the Navy, littoral combat ships, along with those carriers. So what's going to happen in the next 10 years? You're going to see a reduction in terms of the number of forces available. I'd like to say that there will be a commensurate reduction in strategic tasks, but I won't hold my breath. And there will be fewer people in uniform, and that will have an impact on local communities. Maybe not Columbus, because we don't have a lot of military here, but certainly other places that do.
Thanks, Pete. Before we get to Yvonne, I want to give you your warning that it's almost time for questions at the Columbus Metropolitan Club. So you got the greatest panel, I think, in the world here today. So think about your questions, and if you have one, start roaming up to the microphone. We'll be with you in just a minute. But Yvonne, go back to the human service side of this. What actions are being taken to try to combat this, and what do you see the future holding for the human service agencies here in the state?
Absolutely, Chuck. So in terms of predictions, I wish I was better at making those kind of predictions, because I would have predicted I would have been happily married to some rich man and have to talk about this right now. But so clearly I don't make great predictions. But in terms of locally speaking, from the human service sector, I'd like to further some of the comments Chuck made early on in his opening remarks around what we're seeing now and what I think is going to increase as we move forward. One would be nonprofit organizations becoming a lot more creative and innovative around self-sustaining type of options. So thinking about social enterprise and thinking about earned income type of ventures. So there's a number of our members who are already participating in these types of social enterprise ventures. You have Doma International, who operates the Freedom a la carte, and it's a full catering services. You have our very brilliant moderator here from LifeCare Alliance, Check Gehring, who also operates Carrie's Cafe. Goodwill Columbus, Habitat for Humanity, Girl Scouts. So you're looking at a number of these organizations who are generating profits to be able to sustain many of the programs that we see are being cut in the community. The other thing I'd like to bring to your attention that we are increasing is our meaningful collaborations. Just last week, Volunteers of America in Greater Ohio received a $1 million pilot project grant to do some wraparound services for veterans. And I would have to be the first to admit that I was very ignorant to this population of people that needs to be serviced, and not just the actual veterans, but their families. They have families, they have people who are going to school, they have young people who are entering workforce development types of programs. And this is a very unprecedented and just, really signature Columbus, how we have more of a collaborative approach in how we're being able to serve our community. So that's just one other example in terms of how we can boost the economy, but help people become a little bit more self-sufficient while also helping to develop entrepreneurs. You never know what may transpire from some of these collaborations, and so we're finding ourselves being more engaged in that way. The other thing Chuck mentioned was creating this list of like the non-funding asks. So I would push on some of our board members in the room, and I think it's about a third of you who raised your hand. Think about what else you bring to those nonprofit agencies as a board member. It may not necessarily be your fiduciary responsibilities, it may not be the fundraising aspect, but it could be the expertise that you bring so that we can cut some of our overhead costs, so we can cut some of the administrative responsibilities. So think about what else are you doing in terms of if you are a great public officer or a marketer or whatever the case may be, that may be areas that you may be able to provide to those nonprofit organizations so we can cut some of our costs. And then lastly, just really be intentional as a board member. One of the other things, and I think just because Chuck is my buddy, something creative that LifeCare Alliance is doing is leveraging the volunteerism. So I think you all saw the Columbus Dispatch this morning. The article was called "The More Drivers Needed for Meals on Wheels." Well, we are looking at how can we get members of our corporate community a little bit more involved. And if you saw some of the testimonies from this article, these are people who work for AAP, or they work for Nationwide, or they work for some of the other organizations who are taking a moment out their day to volunteer and support the Meals on Wheels program by volunteering to actually deliver those meals in areas where sometimes we don't necessarily have the capacity. And the feel good. So not only does it continue to keep some of our aging population members fed and healthy and whole, but then the feel good that folks have who are volunteering in those programs. So these are just some of the areas, Chuck, that we're looking at now that the nonprofit organizations are already involved with. And I think moving forward in 2014, we're going to see an increase in a lot of these collaborations, a lot of the partnerships, the social enterprise ventures, and then how can we continue to sustain ourselves.
Thank you, Yvonne. And thank you all for listening. Now it's question time. So start making your way up to the microphone here. If you have a question you'd like to ask one of the panelists, we'd love to hear from you. Tradition here at the Metropolitan Club, take as many questions as we can in the time allowed it. Or if, based on Yvonne's comments recently, you'd like to come up and ask Yvonne to spend the rest of her life with you. You just keep it short. So let's go to our first question, and here comes our first questionnaire. Andy?
Happy to break the ice. Thank you all for being here today. I'm kind of wondering, it seems like we ought to be lobbying somebody as citizens. How do we do that? Is anybody doing that? What sorts of things can we do to get this changed? I understand sequestration is going to come up in the next budget round talks, which kick in right after Christmas, and the next round 2 of sequestration is in February or March coming up. So what can we do?
Well, one of the things is there's I wouldn't call it bipartisan, but a Democratic-Republican meeting that's supposed to come up with a budget, some sort of budget deal by early December. So I believe some of our senators are on that committee, and write them and call them, urge them to come to some sort of agreement with the other side, because it's going to take, the only way this is going to be reversed is in a bipartisan fashion. Otherwise, it's going nowhere. It's going to stay steady state.
I might add, virtually all of you belong to some form of non-governmental organization. Some of you have multiple memberships and are on various boards. I think those are excellent avenues to approach members of Congress from and through. I happen to be involved with U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, which is the smart power people. That's why I keep using the phrase. In terms of trying to get the right civil-military mix, we've talked a lot about the military membership things today. Let me just suggest to you, by analogy or comparison to Vietnam, we had in 1968-69 15,000 U.S. State Department personnel ashore in the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam. We don't even have 2,000 people in the Agency for International Development today worldwide. So there is a delicate, I would suggest to you, civil-military mix to address international challenges. And as draconian and difficult as all of this is that you've heard Peter describe to you, you ought to see how bad it is over at the U.S. State Department. So we've got to be thinking about those folks as well as we try to move through this whole process. But I urge you to act through your non-governmental organizations.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Pete and Frank. I just saw this morning, or actually it was yesterday, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities released another report where Senator Portman is introducing another piece of legislation around the continuing resolution. And it behooves us to get more involved in advocacy. And there are just simple steps. Social media makes it very easy for us to be able to raise our voices, to be able to share our concerns. And we shouldn't wait until election season. We shouldn't wait until the campaign season to be able to raise those issues. And I also ask you to consider it on the local, state, to the federal level. So we need to have conversations with our local officials because these cuts are happening in our actual city government as well. And they have some influence, the state representatives, state senators, they have influence with our federal delegation, and we need to continue to have those conversations moving up. So it doesn't necessarily affect us just on the federal level, but we're talking about, again, people, 1,500 young people right here in Ohio are no longer eligible for Head Start. 1,500. We're only at $80 million for workforce development programs. They need to hear from us on the local, state, and federal level.
Yeah, and I would tell you, you can never advocate too much, can you? And I would tell you, in speaking to our local folks, let's say the congressional team from west to east, Stivers, Beatty, and T-Berry, they are very concerned about this. They're working hard on this subject because they understand how it affects Ohio and some of the groups in Ohio. And but they all tell me, and Pat T-Berry told me something. He says, Chuck, there's still great value in the letter. He says, I know we tweet and we Facebook and do everything else, but it's nice to get a letter because he can take them home with him on Saturday and read them, things like that, and it does make a difference to him. So send your legislators, whether it's them or Senators Portman or Brown, or even don't forget to talk about this with your state folks because the state folks are concerned with us. And they want to advocate for this. So there's a lot of synergies there. So just keep advocating. So for our next question, I see Lori Overmeyer.
Thank you. Thank you, Chuck. Lori Overmeyer from Gettler Associates. And this question is really for, I think, specifically Chuck and Yvonne. I've read some studies over the last year that when an agency loses a majority of its government funding, sometimes it requires a 60% increase in individual donors to be able to make up those funds. So in this season of giving, where 40% of gifts are given between October and December each year, nonprofit agencies have trained us well that the holiday time is the time the time to give. What has been the reaction to from nonprofits to their donors, their individual corporate and foundation donors, about the sequestration? Is it an issue that they're able to relate? Because often, sometimes, donors really respond when they understand what's happening in their backyard.
Okay, I'll take a stab at it first, Chuck. In terms of some of our nonprofit agencies in which the federal funding is germane to their work, you're absolutely correct. They are taking opportunities to cultivate those relationships with individual donors. There was a report released by the Philanthropy Ohio, formerly Great Makers Ohio, that showed an increase in the last 10 years of individual donations versus foundations and corporations. And so it is an opportunity for us to be able to not only cultivate those relationships, but attract new donors. And some of those new donors are some of our younger professionals. So the generation X/Y, if you will, and finding out what are some of their interests, what are their passion areas. What I notice is we're becoming a lot more sophisticated with our donor database. That's number one, to be able to really hone in on those passion areas. And the other thing is using some more innovative types of events and activities to be able to bring in those potential donors to talk a little bit about what is that we're doing. So no longer just a, kind of antiquated newsletter, not that a newsletter, there's nothing wrong with a newsletter, but moving them to more electronic use of how we're being able to tell our story. And then lastly, producing outcomes. I would be the first to admit from, being a nonprofit for almost 20 years that we have not always been the best, tellers of our story. We do a great job in a nonprofit, and not just in terms of helping people reach their potential, but we are a very large economic engine in this community. The nonprofit in Central Ohio is the 4th largest employer here. We pay employees $2.5 million in taxes just in Central Ohio alone. So we're beginning to learn how to message and package what it is that we're doing so that our donors are not only continue to give, but they're continue to be attracted to that work and that outcomes.
And I would just add quickly that I found there's still a lot of misconceptions about what this does to people and which agencies are affected. There's a lot of agencies that aren't affected because they don't get federal funding, but many are. And unfortunately, because of the way it was set up years and years ago, a lot of those agencies did not start fundraising until very, very recently. Well, I can tell you, having gotten some new programming and some new counties to serve past several years, when you start fundraising for the first time, it takes a long time to get going. You don't just snap your fingers, send out a holiday appeal card, and in comes $500,000. Doesn't work, okay? It takes a long time to develop donors and people to really understand it, and frankly, this is a tough subject to understand. That's one of the reasons I'm here. It's not the most positive topic, like I said, but one that I think the community is really interested in and wants to learn about them. And so I think it's a good way to educate the folks and get it out there today. I think we have time for one more quick question.
Happy to do that honor. Chuck, you got to ask the panel what their view for the future was, so I'd like to throw that to you. You know, what do you see coming forward? But also I'd like the panel to comment. It seems like we have a very stark choice of two stories looking forward to, you know, America and our society's future. Is this it? And what do you see? Where are we going?
I'll do it real quick because I've commented on this in other places because we've been out reassuring people that we're doing okay at LifeCare Alliance and are going to hang in there. We are very blessed here in Central Ohio. If you don't realize it, I think many of you do realize it because you're at the Columbus Metropolitan Club, but we have as model a program in some of these programs as there is anywhere in the United States. We've probably got the best food bank. We certainly got the best program like LifeCare Alliance. There's nothing like us in the country, et cetera, et cetera. And that's because we have really good partners who have helped us with this. The AAA, the Area Agency on Aging, and the Franklin County Office on Aging, who are some of our best buddies and help us through this, really make things go. But I'll tell you, frankly, what's going to happen in other parts of the country and in other parts of Ohio, you will see in the next 3 years, I'll just speak for us, you're going to see Meals on Wheels program drop like flies. We've already seen, we picked up Marion the first of the year because nobody else would take it and they had some financial issues. You're going to see this over and over and over again. As I quoted you those statistics from Meals on Wheels of America, there's no question these programs are just going to go away. And there's going to be nobody to pick them up. And in many states and in many parts of Ohio. So we're working hard to prevent that from happening by doing some of the innovative stuff we talked about earlier. We don't want to just sit there and let it happen to us. We want to start catering companies and fundraise more, and we want to do the volunteers, get as many volunteers as we can, et cetera, et cetera. It's just one of those things we have to do to keep going. What do you want to add, folks? Anything?
Well,
Pete?
I think the prediction that America's going to go downhill is premature. We're a rich nation. In the past, we've done without a lot of these services and somehow managed to survive. I think more will be thrown on the private sector and charity. Americans have an aversion to paying taxes, but they open their pocketbooks for charitable causes, and so you'll see more done in that realm. My prediction was that this sort of thing, domestic discretionary spending would be cut, the military would be cut, and taxes would be raised before Congress and the President actually dealt with the real crux of our budgetary problem, which is entitlements. And so far, my prediction has been borne out. I think there's more pain to be had. This is just the tip of the iceberg. But when Americans, through their elected representatives, do something about Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, then we'll see the sorts of things affected by sequestration may be eased.
Well, thank you all. I think you've all done a wonderful job today, and we appreciate you listening. And now, Karen, back to you.
Thanks. I told you it was scary. So if you would like to see this again or show it to a member of your family or one of your friends, you can see this on YouTube, and the best way to get through to it is to go to our website, which is columbusmetroclub.org. We were going to have some coffee and cookies in the lobby. You're welcome to come out and talk some more about this. If you would like to get on our email list, just take your tag and stick your business card in it, and we'll put you on our email list. And I want to thank once again Check Gehring, Yvonne Hunnicutt, Frank Titus, and Peter Mansoor for being here. Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming.